What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge, and it's time that we take a look at the carrier changes in 0.4.0, as well as have a little discussion about where carriers are at the moment. But first off, we're going to quickly go over the changes in 0.4.0, and then I'm going to go back over them again and give you my opinions and my thoughts. And then I'll have a little bit of a freeform monologue where I'll talk about what I think about carriers, and where I personally think they stand, and how the development went, and all that. Both the Hosho and the Langley lost their suicide loadout. That means with both of these carriers there's no longer a choice. You have one plane loadout and that's all you're going to get. For the Hosho that means you have one fighter and 2 torpedo bomber squadrons. And for the Langley this means you have one fighter and 1 torpedo bomber squadron. The Hosho furthermore now needs a fighter upgrade to reach the strength of its old fighters. It now has stock fighters that are quite a bit worse than they were before. Its torpedo bombers received a slight buff, with their speed increasing from 85 to 95 and their hit points increasing from 590 to quite a significant 790. The Langley's torpedo bombers had their damage increased from 5,900 to 8,500. And that of course also changed the stock torpedo bomber damage on the Bogue, because those stock torpedo bombers are the upgraded torpedo bombers on the Langley. The Zuiho now also needs a torpedo bomber upgrade, but they are the old torpedo bombers and there are now worse stock torpedo bombers. The Ryujo's fighters had their ammunition loadout reduced from 53 to 38. There have been absolutely no changes whatsoever to the Hiryo, Shokaku, Taiho, Independence, Ranger, Lexington and Essex. But the Hakuryo gained a fighter upgrade, so its top fighter's speed went from 160 knots to 174 knots. The ammunition loadout dropped by 1 and the hit points increased from 1830 to 1970. The Midway class aircraft carrier has been added as the Tier 10 aircraft carrier for the United States Navy. It comes with 3 plane loadouts. The stock loadout has 2 fighters, 1 torpedo bomber and 2 dive bombers. Then it has a fighter-centric loadout of 3 fighters and 2 dive bombers, and a more damage-oriented loadout with 0 fighters, 2 torpedo bombers and 3 dive bombers. The Midway also has the worst concealment in the game, with a surface detection range of 18.4 kilometers and an air detection range of 18.1 kilometers. Unless you hug an island, it is impossible to hide the Midway. I'm going to have pictures of the top planes in the background, so if you want to see all the stats you can pause the video. But it is fair to say that the Midway has the best planes in the game. Its fighters being the McDonnell F-2H Banshee, its torpedo bombers being the Douglas A-2D Skyshark, and its dive bombers being the Douglas XS-B-2D-1 Destroyer. But wait, this just in! The second round of the 0.4.0 test server just began, and the Tier 9 and 10 carriers had their loadouts changed, specifically their so-called suicide loadouts. The Essex and Midway lost their 0 fighter, 2 torpedo bomber, 3 dive bomber layout, and traded it for a 1 fighter, 2 torpedo bomber, 2 dive bombers loadout. Similarly, the Taiho and Hakuryu lost their 0 fighter, 4 torpedo bomber, 3 dive bomber and 0 fighter, 4 torpedo bomber, 4 dive bomber loadouts respectively, and basically swapped 1 torpedo bomber for 1 fighter. In the first round of the 0.4.0 test server, they also made manual torpedo drop a 2-point commander skill. It's safe to say that everyone hated this absolutely stupid idea, and good on Wargaming because they changed it in the second round of the test server and is no longer a commander skill. Now those are all the carrier changes in 0.4.0. If you're not interested in my opinion on the state of carriers, then thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Alright, they're gone. Let's talk Turkey. So the first problem I'm having with this picture is, what does this look like? To me, this looks like finishing touches. There are 7 carriers on this list, specifically the high tier carriers, who have received absolutely no changes whatsoever. And it's the high tier carriers that people are complaining about the most. Instead, they dick around with the low tier carriers and make changes that are completely inconsequential. This has me really worried about the state of carriers, because as we now know, this is in fact the open beta patch and the open beta is just around the corner. These are the carriers that are going into open beta. What a sad state of affair this is. Not a single one of these changes addresses any of the real problems with carriers. Wow, the Midway. I mean, firstly it has exactly the same plane loadout as the Essex, and the concealment rating. Jeez. 18.4 kilometer surface detection range. That is ridiculous. And I already made a point earlier to name the planes that it's going to get, but let me do that again. So its fighters are the McDonnell F-2H Banshee. Its torpedo bombers are the Douglas A-2D Skyshark, and its dive bombers are the Douglas XS-B-2D Destroyer. You what, mate? Are you having a giggle? These are Korean War era planes. The Banshee is a jet fighter. I thought we were not going to get jet fighters in this game. I'm pretty sure they at some point said there were not going to be jet fighters in this game. And yet here we have jets. What the hell is up with that? Why do we need jet fighters? This furthermore cements the problem between US and Japanese carriers. But let me take it from the top. When I first started playing the game at the beginning of the closed beta test, I really was a big fan of carriers. I thought they were great. I thought they were much better than artillery was in World of Tanks because they were more active, more involved. There was a lot more strategy and skill involved in playing them. And yet they never felt overpowered. They always felt like they could easily be countered by destroyers. And there was a neat little mini game going on between the carriers because you always had the option of trying to kill the opposing carrier before he gets to do any of his damage. But apparently we can't have that. Apparently it has to be just as mind-numbingly boring, random and stupid as artillery in World of Tanks. The biggest issue with carriers right now are the absolutely stupid loadout changes that they made in 0.3.1. Before that, you had a good amount of fighters and a good amount of torpedo bombers, and then later in the tiers, it also added a few dive bombers. You didn't really care about the dive bombers that much because they kind of sucked. And let's be honest, dive bombers still suck. They are still terrible because they don't fly in a predictable manner. It's so incredibly hard to hit anything with manual drop dive bombers, not because, oh, it takes so much skill. No, because the way the planes fly is fucking stupid and random as hell. And that makes it very unpredictable as to how long it's actually going to take your stupid bombs to land. And when you just right click on something, a lot of the time you're just not hitting anything. And also, you're then just right clicking, and right clicking is so boring. So nobody cares about dive bombers, but we have to have 1 million of them in every single loadout. Why? What is the goddamn problem with having fighters and torpedo bombers supported by some dive bombers? If you can't make dive bombers fun, then just make them an addition and not the main bulk of your fucking planes. And this immediately and perfectly leads into the next point, which is, why is it that IJN carriers are everywhere? And they're all using the suicide loadout. Why is that? Because nobody wants to fucking run the absolutely boring fighter and dive bomber loadouts on the American carriers. If you have never played a carrier, imagine clicking on a squad and then right-clicking on an enemy squad or right-clicking on an enemy ship, because that is what you're doing in American carriers with fighters and dive bombers. It is one of the most boring things I have ever encountered in a video game. It is incredible. And so because this stupid fighter loadout on the American carriers is boring, oh, and also because air kills don't give any goddamn experience, and because the suicide loadout on the American carriers just isn't that good, because until you get to high tier you usually only get 1 torpedo bomber and then a whole bunch of fucking dive bombers, because oh sure, dive bombers need to be the thing. Obviously most people just go and play IJN carriers instead. Because they're starting at the mid-tiers, you actually get a balanced loadout. One that has fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in decent numbers. Where you get like 3 torpedo bombers and then a bunch of dive bombers. Again, nobody gives a shit. But their suicide loadouts are better, earlier. They get more squads, earlier. Which makes their gameplay more fun because there's more to do. No strategy fan or RTS fan in their right mind wants to just pan the camera, click, and watch as irrelevant things happen. That is not why people play RTS games. That is why Command & Conquer 4 Tiberium Spastics was such a flop. Because there was nothing to do, and there's nothing to do with carrier play either. Even if killing planes gave adequate experience, it would still be boring, because it's still just right-clicking on enemy fighters and then just watching as the thing happens. And there's nothing you can do to influence the battle between fighters, and well, whoever engages first actually does a little bit more damage, so it has a little bit of an advantage. And of course, whoever is higher tier has the advantage, because it's simply a tiered system, and whoever has the higher DPS wins in the fight. And so no one plays US carriers until late tier, because why would you when IJN carriers are just so much better? And this is only going to get worse with open beta, because then it's actually going to take a lot of games to get to high tier. Why would you play US Navy carriers when their loadouts are so much more boring, they gain so much less experience because they have less torpedo bombers, And on top of that, they also have less squads, so they have less to do. And the less US carriers there are, the less fighter loadouts you are going to see. Because what is the point in fighters? It doesn't give you any experience, and it helps your team marginally, but who cares, right? But that helping your team really only comes into effect when it actually helps you as well. That's pretty much how it works in multiplayer games. People are inherently selfish, and when you don't reward them for something, they're not gonna do it, even if it helps the team. And so nobody is going to run the fighter setups. People are just going to run the suicide loadouts. And it's going to become more and more prevalent, and people are going to complain more and more about fucking torpedoes until Wargaming then goes ahead and nerfs torpedoes, because apparently they cannot see the actual problem with carriers. And because they nerf torpedoes, they then also nerf fucking destroyers again. And the things they actually fix about carriers are things that don't need fixing. Nobody cared that the Langley and the Hosho had alternate loadouts. Nobody cared that the Langley and the Hosho had no upgrades for their fighters and torpedo bombers. I will say this, they did get rid of the manual drop commander skill, and kudos to them. That was a needed change, and it had to happen. And I was probably gonna have a 5-minute rant about just this topic alone, and I'm actually kind of glad I don't have to do that. But let's look at some of the other nonsensical stuff that they fixed that didn't need fixing, like giving manual drop on Japanese carriers the same accuracy as auto drop. Because yeah, right-clicking is so much fun, isn't it? Like increasing the size of the engagement circles. Like making it so that torpedo bombers and dive bombers never increase in damage because fuck enjoyable progression. All of these things were goddamn band-aids. None of them addressed the actual problem of the loadouts not being enjoyable. They tried to create this flavor where American carriers use their fighters. But oh, they don't get torpedo bombers, we'll give them dive bombers. Yeah, well, that was a stupid idea, because now all that really is left is one loadout. One loadout to rule them all. High-tier IJN carriers with the suicide loadout. That is what is played. That is all that is played. I haven't seen a tier 7 or higher US carrier in weeks. It's all IJN carriers, and they always run the suicide loadout because it's the most sensible thing to do. Seriously, Wargaming, is that your goal? Do you want to limit the number of carrier players by making it the most pointless, obnoxious, and boring grind imaginable? Well, mission fucking accomplished. I've been Eldritch Master Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.